I am an old woman now, and if I am honest with you, the American reading or listening to these words, I must begin with a confession. When the war ended, I did not feel liberated. I felt hunted. My name is Anna Weiss. I was 23 years old in the spring of 1945, a civilian secretary from Munich who had spent the last years of the Reich typing orders I barely understood. And the first thing I want you to know is this. When I heard the word America, I did not think of freedom. I thought of destruction. That fear did not come from experience. It came from what we were taught, repeated so often it settled into our bones. That American soldiers were brutal, careless, more beast than man, and that captivity would mean humiliation, violence, and erasure. When the guns finally fell silent across Europe and church bells rang for others, for girls like me, the silence felt like the moment before a blow lands, because the war had ended, but our safety had not begun. I remember opening my small diary years later, my hands already stiff with age, and seeing the thin, nervous handwriting of a younger woman who believed she was about to disappear from the world. In those final days, Germany was not a nation anymore. It was a landscape of ashes and rumors, and among the rumors, none was stronger than this. The Americans would make examples of us. We clung to that belief because fear was the only thing that still felt solid. I was not a soldier, not an officer, not a criminal, yet I felt guilty simply for surviving, and terrified because survival now depended on the mercy of an enemy we had been taught to see as wolves. I remember the railway yard as if it were burned into my eyes. A gray morning, heavy with smoke and damp stone. Lines of young women standing with battered suitcases and hollow faces, our uniforms threadbare, our boots cracked, our hair unwashed from weeks of flight and collapse. Some of us were barely out of school, others hardened by years of air raid sirens and night shifts. But all of us shared the same quiet dread, the knowledge that we were being gathered not to go home, but to be taken away. No one cried anymore. Tears had been spent long before, somewhere between the bomb shelters and the hunger winters. We whispered to one another in low voices, repeating what we had been told, that the Americans would not spare us, that this was where dignity ended. I stood there with my diary hidden inside my coat, feeling smaller than I ever had in my life, watching the dark wooden train cars waiting on the tracks, knowing they had once carried soldiers east and now would carry us west, away from everything familiar. As the guards called us forward and the engine hissed, a strange calm settled over me, the calm of someone who believes there is nothing left to lose. When the metal wheels finally groaned and the train began to move, I wrote a single line in my diary with shaking hands, a line I would read again decades later in a quiet American living room. I think I am about to vanish from the world. The railway platform was crowded, yet it felt empty, filled with bodies but drained of spirit, a place where movement continued even though life itself seemed to have stopped. We stood there as a line of defeated girls and women, our coats hanging loose from bodies thinned by hunger, our skirts mended too many times, our suitcases light because there was nothing left to pack. Some clutched small bundles tied with string, others held nothing at all, their hands folded as if already resigned. I remember noticing how different we all were, and how alike we had become. There were girls barely 20, faces still soft beneath layers of soot, and women older than me whose eyes had hardened after years of sirens and rubble, and a few who whispered prayers under their breath, fingers moving over worn rosaries as if faith itself were the last possession the war had not taken. No one spoke loudly, because loud voices belonged to another world, a world before ruins and ration cards, before surrender. The whispers passed along the line instead, quiet and persistent, carrying the same sentence again and again. The Americans will not spare us. Some said they had heard it from officers during the collapse. Others from neighbors who claimed to know someone who had already disappeared. And though no one could prove it, the fear was shared so completely that it became truth. I looked beyond the platform and saw what was left of our country. Buildings with their windows punched out like blind eyes, church towers broken and jagged, rail lines twisted where bombs had struck, and children standing at a distance, thin as shadows, watching us with a curiosity that felt heavier than pity. This was the Germany we were leaving behind, a land that no longer protected its daughters, a place that had asked for loyalty and given only hunger and smoke in return. I remember thinking that the platform itself seemed tired. The stones darkened by years of boots and rain, the air thick with coal dust and dampness, as if even the ground understood that something final was happening. There were no farewell speeches, no flags, no promises, only the shuffling of feet and the sound of metal as guards adjusted their rifles. A woman near me crossed herself and murmured that whatever awaited us could not be worse than what we had already survived. But her voice betrayed her, thin and unsteady. I did not answer her because I did not believe it. I reached into my coat and touched the small notebook hidden there, the one thing I had kept for myself. And for the first time since the surrender, I opened it with the intention of writing. My hand trembled as I put down a few simple words, not about politics or blame, but about what I saw: the faces, the silence, the sense that we were being gathered like debris after a storm. Writing did not comfort me, but it anchored me, reminding me that I was still a person, still capable of observing, even as control over my life slipped away. When the guards finally called us forward and the doors of the train cars were pulled open, a low sound moved through the group, not a cry, not a protest, but something closer to a collective breath being released. We climbed aboard without resistance, helping one another up, because resistance required hope, and hope had been exhausted. As the doors slid shut and the engine coughed to life, the platform began to drift away, and with it the broken outline of Germany, receding slowly, silently, as if the country itself were turning its back on us. The journey across the Atlantic erased any remaining sense of time, turning days into a gray, heaving blur inside the steel belly of the ship, where the air smelled of salt, diesel, and sickness, and the sea's endless motion punished bodies already weakened by hunger. We slept in stacked bunks bolted to the walls, rose when the engines slowed, and learned quickly that the ocean did not care about fear or defeat. Many of us were seasick for days, clutching thin blankets, listening to the groan of metal and the slap of water against the hull, as if the ship itself were breathing. It was there, far from land and certainty, that the first crack appeared in everything we had been taught to believe. One morning, A guard's voice echoed down the passage, and we were handed trays. Real trays, not the tin scraps we remembered from home, but sturdy ones bearing pale bread, thick slices that bent without breaking, meat that glistened with fat, and steaming mugs of coffee whose bitter smell filled the compartment. The sight froze us where we stood. No one reached out at first. A murmur spread, low and tense, the same suspicion spoken in different words. Do not eat, it could be poisoned. We had learned to mistrust abundance, because in Germany, abundance had vanished long before the surrender, replaced by turnip soup and bread stretched with sawdust, by portions measured not to nourish, but to endure. I remembered the last winter at home, how a single crust was divided with care, how hunger sharpened every sound and thought, and how even then we were told to expect worse from the enemy. Now the enemy was feeding us, and the contradiction was almost unbearable. Some women pushed the trays away, shaking their heads. Others stared as if the food might dissolve if they blinked, and a few, unable to wait any longer, ate quickly and silently, tears slipping down their cheeks as if ashamed of their own hunger. I held my bread for a long moment, feeling its weight in my hands, noticing how it smelled of wheat rather than desperation. And I was afraid, not of poison, but of what it would mean if it was real. Finally, with the ship rolling beneath my feet, I broke off a small piece and put it to my mouth, expecting bitterness, punishment, something to confirm the stories we had been told. Instead, there was only bread, warm and filling, and in that instant a quiet shock moved through me, deeper than fear, because nothing happened except that my body responded with relief. Around me, the compartment filled with the sound of chewing and low sobs, and someone whispered, almost accusingly, that they were feeding us the way they fed themselves. I did not know what to think, only that for the first time in years, my stomach felt calm, and that calm frightened me more than hunger ever had. The days passed like this, meals arriving with the same steady regularity as the waves, eroding suspicion, grain by grain, until one morning the motion of the ship changed and voices rose above the engines. We were allowed onto the deck, and there, beyond the rail, the horizon looked different, sharper, closer, and as land slowly emerged from the gray, I realized that America was no longer a rumor or a threat, but a place rising out of the sea, waiting for us. Nothing we had imagined prepared us for the moment the ship finally slowed and the harbor came into view, because what rose before us was not a scarred coastline or a ruined port, but a city standing whole and upright, as if the war had never reached it. I remember gripping the rail as the fog lifted and buildings appeared with clean lines and unbroken windows, cranes moving calmly along the docks, and streets beyond that showed no wounds, no blackened shells, no hollowed-out walls. Then the Statue of Liberty emerged, tall and untouched, and though no one around me spoke, I felt something collapse quietly inside my chest. Not drama, not despair, but the slow failure of a belief I had carried for years. We had been told America was brutal, reckless, indifferent to human life. Yet here was its gateway, orderly and intact, watching us arrive without anger. People stood along the piers, men and women in ordinary clothes, some curious, some silent, a few calling out words we could not understand. But there were no stones thrown, no spit, no shouting, none of the hatred we had been warned to expect. We were marched down the gangway under guard, our boots striking the wooden planks in a rhythm that sounded too loud in the open air, and I waited for the moment when humiliation would begin, when faces would twist and hands would strike. But it did not come. The soldiers guiding us were firm and efficient, their expressions unreadable, and to my confusion, that neutrality unsettled me more than cruelty would have. As we moved through the port, I kept looking, unable to stop myself, taking in details that felt almost obscene after years of ruin. Trucks that ran smoothly, warehouses stacked with goods, uniforms that were clean and well-fitted, a sky free of smoke. This was when the truth finally pressed itself upon me, heavy and undeniable. America had not been destroyed. While our cities lay in rubble and our children scavenged among stones, this country stood fed, organized, and alive. I felt then what defeat truly was, not the sound of surrender or the lowering of flags, but the realization that the enemy had lived in another world altogether, one our leaders had never shown us. I thought of Munich, of streets reduced to dust, of nights spent in cellars counting the seconds between explosions, and the contrast burned more sharply than any insult could have. No one said a word as we were herded toward waiting buses, because there was nothing left to say. The evidence was all around us, and it accused more than it threatened. As I stepped onto the bus and felt the engine hum beneath my feet, I understood that the war had ended not only on the battlefield, but inside my mind, where the last pieces of propaganda were finally giving way to what my eyes could no longer deny. The bus doors closed, the harbor slipped behind us, and as we rolled inland along smooth roads bordered by green fields and intact houses, I knew we were being carried deeper into a country that had won not just with weapons, but with a reality we had never been allowed to see. The bus slowed and turned through a wide gate topped with barbed wire, and in that moment, every muscle in my body tightened, because this was the place we had been warned about, the point where dignity was supposed to end. We were ordered down one by one, our names taken carefully, spelled aloud, written onto forms with an efficiency that felt cold but not cruel. And our few possessions were catalogued and set aside as if we were objects to be stored rather than enemies to be punished. I remember the strange quiet of it all, the absence of shouting, the lack of blows, and how unsettling that calm was after years of chaos. Our uniforms were taken and replaced with plain work clothes, clean but shapeless, and as I changed, I felt exposed, certain that humiliation was only being delayed, not denied. Yet when I looked around the camp, what I saw did not match the images that had haunted me since the surrender. The barracks were intact and orderly, the paths swept, the guard towers standing but not looming, and the soldiers moved with a routine professionalism that made the place feel more like a factory than a punishment ground. In Germany, camps meant filth, hunger, and arbitrary cruelty. Places whispered about with fear. But here, the air smelled of wood and dust rather than decay, and the fences, though real, did not feel like they were closing in. Still, none of us trusted what we saw. Trust had been trained out of us. As we were lined up again, whispers moved quickly through the group, tighter and more urgent than before, each woman adding her own fear to the same story. This order is a trick. This is where it will begin. This is where they break us. Someone said the showers were not for washing, but for degradation. Another swore she had heard they would be watched, mocked, stripped of what little pride we had left. I felt my throat tighten as we were directed toward a low building set apart from the barracks, steam curling faintly from its vents, the sound of water echoing inside. Every step toward it felt heavier than the last. I thought of all the things we had been told, of the way propaganda had painted this moment as inevitable, and of how powerless I felt standing there, knowing that resistance would change nothing. Around me, faces were pale and rigid, some women staring straight ahead, others clutching their sleeves or whispering prayers. And I realized that this fear bound us together more tightly than any fence. The guards spoke briefly, gesturing us forward, their voices firm but without malice, and that, too, confused me, because I had prepared myself for insults, for laughter, for rough hands, not for this measured restraint. As the line moved, I felt my heartbeat in my ears, each step bringing me closer to what I believed would be the moment my last illusion fell away. When it was finally my turn, I stood at the threshold of the tiled room, the warmth rising to meet me, my mind racing through every warning I had ever heard. And before I crossed it, one thought settled over me with a strange clarity. Whatever happens next, I will remember this for the rest of my life. Inside the tiled room, the air was warm and wet, carrying a clean, unfamiliar scent that stopped me in place, because instead of shouting or laughter, we were handed something small and solid, placed into our palms with quiet efficiency, a bar of soap. I remember staring at it as if it were an object from another life, thick and white, smooth at the edges, heavier than I expected, smelling faintly of flowers rather than chemicals or decay, and for a moment, my mind could not make sense of it. Soap had not been part of my world for years. In Germany, we had learned to wash with cold water, when there was any at all, to scrape dirt from our skin with cloth, to accept lice and grime as permanent companions. Now the guards motioned us toward the showers, and when the valves turned, hot water poured down in steady streams. Not a trickle, not a rationed mercy, but real heat that sank into bone and muscle. The sound filled the room, a roar that drowned out thought, and around me women froze, then hesitated, as if waiting for the moment when the kindness would turn into cruelty. It did not. One by one, hands lifted, soap touched skin, and the impossible began to happen. Dirt loosened, hair softened, and months of fear seemed to slide away with the water. Some women laughed, sharp and nervous. Others stood rigid beneath the spray, as if afraid to move. And a few sank down onto the tiles and sobbed openly, their shoulders shaking because the release was too sudden, too much to bear. I felt tears rise before I understood why. My face hot, my throat tight, the water mixing with something I had held back for far too long. It was not joy, and it was not relief alone, but a deep confusion that cut through me, because this was not what we had been prepared for. No one shouted at us. No one watched with contempt. No one struck us for our weakness. The room was filled only with steam, water, and the quiet sounds of women rediscovering what it felt like to be clean. I washed my hands again and again, noticing the color return to my skin, the way the soap slid and foamed, and with each movement, something inside me cracked, not loudly, but enough to let a truth slip through. When the water finally stopped and towels were handed out, clean and rough against my skin, I felt unsteady, as if I had crossed a line I could never uncross. That night, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of starch and cotton, my hair still damp against my neck, I took out my diary and wrote with hands that would not quite stop shaking. I did not write about America or Germany or victory or defeat. I wrote one sentence, simple and exact, because anything more would have been a lie. They did not beat me. They did not mock me. They did not break me. They gave me soap and washed me clean. As the lights dimmed and the barracks settled into uneasy silence, I lay awake listening to the unfamiliar quiet of an American night. Insects humming outside instead of bombs overhead. And I understood that something irreversible had begun, because the enemy I had feared for so long had done what hunger and war had not. They had reminded me, against my will, that I was still human. The next shock came not with violence, but with smell, drifting down the corridor before we even saw the room. A warm, heavy scent of bread, coffee, and meat that made my stomach tighten with both hunger and dread. The mess hall was long and bright, tables set in rows, steam rising from metal containers as trays were passed along with practiced speed. And for a moment, we stopped at the doorway, uncertain, because abundance had become something to fear. In Germany, food had meant calculation and sacrifice. Thin soup stretched to feed many, crusts saved and hidden, meals spoken of in whispers. And now, here it was laid out openly, without ceremony, without apology. Some women stepped forward and then froze, their hands hovering as if the food might vanish or explode, while others shook their heads and backed away, unable to reconcile the sight with the letters they carried in their pockets from home. I remember the sound of cutlery beginning slowly, unevenly, the scrape of metal against plates, and then the quiet of people eating who did not want to be seen enjoying it. The guards watched from the walls with professional distance, not urging, not mocking, simply present. And that restraint made everything harder because it offered no enemy to push against. I sat with my tray and could not lift my spoon, thinking of my mother in Munich, of the last time I had seen her boil weeds to make something resembling supper, of neighbors trading rumors for scraps, of the way hunger had hollowed faces I loved. Around me, a few women pushed their plates away, tears running unchecked, their shame louder than any protest, because to eat well here felt like a betrayal of those who had nothing. Others ate quickly, eyes down, driven by instinct, and I did not judge them, because hunger has its own authority. Partway through the meal, my name was called, and a folded envelope was placed into my hand, thin and creased, the handwriting familiar enough to make my chest ache before I opened it. It was from Munich, from my mother, written in careful lines that spoke of ruins, of cold rooms, of making do with almost nothing. And as I read, the smell of food around me turned sour in my throat. I realized then that this was the true reversal of everything we had been taught. Not that the enemy fed us, but that they fed us while our own people starved. I forced myself to eat slowly, deliberately, tasting each bite as if it were evidence I would need later, my body responding with gratitude my mind did not yet permit. When the meal ended and trays were collected, the room emptied in a subdued silence, and no one spoke on the walk back to the barracks, because each of us carried the same impossible weight. That night, lying awake, the words from the letter repeating themselves, until they lost shape. I understood the sentence that would stay with me long after the war itself faded into memory. A sentence I could not escape no matter how I tried. I am full, and my mother is hungry. Work began quietly, without ceremony, and that in itself felt strange, because after years of chaos, the simple rhythm of being assigned a task and expected to complete it began to reshape my days. I was sent to the laundry, where rows of American uniforms moved through our hands, heavy with dust and sweat, marked with names stitched carefully onto the fabric. Reminders that these belonged to men with lives untouched by our ruins. The room was hot and loud with the churn of machines, steam rising as we scrubbed and folded. And at first, I worked mechanically, keeping my eyes down, unsure how to feel about tending to the clothes of the enemy. Yet there was dignity in the labor, a steadiness that required attention but not fear. And as hours passed, I realized something unsettling. I was no longer counting time by hunger or dread, but by completed piles and ringing bells. We were paid small wages in camp script, slips of paper that felt absurdly light in my hand, and when I learned they could be used at the canteen, curiosity pulled me there despite myself. Inside, shelves were lined with items I had not seen in years, not even in memory. Chocolate bars wrapped in bright paper, cigarettes, pencils, jars of jam, and small tubes of lipstick that looked almost indecent in their promise. I remember standing still, unable to move, because each object carried a weight far greater than its size. Buying chocolate felt like theft from those at home. Lipstick like a betrayal of mourning. And yet, when I exchanged my wages and held them, my hands trembled with a gratitude I could not fully accept. The first bite of chocolate was overwhelming, sweet to the point of pain, and I turned away so others would not see the tears that came with it. Around me, women laughed softly, tested colors on their lips, or tucked small purchases into pockets as if hiding contraband. And for brief moments, the camp echoed with something close to normal life. That was when the shame crept in alongside the relief, because letters from Germany continued to arrive, describing cellars and cold and children growing thinner by the week, and every comfort here cast a longer shadow back home. I found myself scrubbing harder at uniforms, as if effort could justify nourishment, folding each shirt with care as though precision might balance the scales. The Americans passed through the laundry with nods and brief words, neither warm nor cruel, and that ordinary treatment unsettled me most of all, because it allowed me to feel human again, not an object or a warning. As weeks turned into months, my body grew stronger, my thoughts clearer, and with that clarity came a new fear I had not expected. Rumors of repatriation drifted through the barracks, names whispered, dates guessed, and instead of relief, my chest tightened. I imagined returning to Munich with full cheeks and clean hands, facing a mother still rationing hope alongside food, and the thought filled me with dread. One night, after counting my remaining script and tucking my diary beneath my pillow, I admitted to myself what I could not yet say aloud, that I was afraid not of captivity, but of going home. The rumors of return settled over the camp like a cold fog, creeping into conversations and silences alike. And I discovered to my shame that the thought of going home frightened me more than captivity ever had. Germany, as it existed in my mind now, was not a place of welcome, but of hunger. a country bent inward on itself, counting crumbs and losses, and I knew that when I returned, I would carry the visible proof of my absence in my body. I was healthier than I had been in years, my skin clearer, my strength restored by regular meals and rest, and that knowledge weighed on me like guilt, because I imagined the faces waiting for me, my mother's careful eyes, neighbors measuring without words, and I feared what they would see. I pictured myself standing in a bomb-damaged street, clean and fed, trying to explain how the enemy had treated me with order and restraint, while my own people endured shortages and cold, and I felt certain that no explanation would ever be enough. Letters from Munich spoke of barter and scarcity, of families living in cellars, of children growing accustomed to hunger. And with each line I read, the distance between who I had been and who I was becoming grew wider. It was then that a thought I had avoided finally took shape, sharp and unavoidable. It was not America that had betrayed us first. We had been asked for obedience and sacrifice, promised protection and victory, and in return we were left with ruins and fear, while those who demanded loyalty vanished or fell silent. The Americans had not made me afraid to return. They had made me see too clearly what waited for me there. This realization did not bring comfort, only a deeper unease, because it dismantled the last refuge of hatred I had relied on to make sense of the world. Without hatred, there was only responsibility, and I did not know how to carry it. At night, I lay awake listening to the steady sounds of the camp, the guards' footsteps, the distant hum of machinery, and I wondered whether I would ever feel at ease again in a place where hunger and suspicion ruled daily life. The women around me spoke in hushed tones about trains eastward, about papers and lists, about the moment when names would be read aloud, and each whisper tightened my chest. I told myself I should be grateful for release, that this was what we had waited for, but gratitude did not come. Instead, there was a quiet panic, the sense that I was being pushed back into a life that no longer fit me. One morning, as we stood assembled with the air sharp against our faces, an officer began to read from a list, his voice even and impersonal, and with each name called, the space around me seemed to narrow. When I heard my own, Anna Weiss, I felt a strange stillness settle over me, not relief, not fear, but the certainty that whatever came next would demand more from me than survival ever had. I am an old woman as I write this, my hands slower now, my memories sharper than my body, and when I look back across the long line of years, I know that I was not defeated by bombs or guns, but by something far quieter and far more lasting. I did not come to America believing in its goodness, and I did not leave Germany hating my own country. But what happened in between changed the shape of my life in ways no battlefield ever could. I have lived long enough to know that war does not make heroes out of nations, only survivors and graves, and I do not praise it, not even in victory. What I remember most clearly is not the noise of engines or the orders shouted across fences, but the small moments that dismantled what fear had built inside me. The weight of bread in my hand, the warmth of water on my skin, the ordinary calm of being treated as a person when I expected to be treated as less than one. For years after my return, I tried to explain this to myself, without sounding ungrateful or disloyal, because gratitude felt dangerous, as if acknowledging it might erase the suffering of those who did not share my fortune. Yet time has stripped away my excuses, and what remains is simple and difficult to accept. America did not win me over with speeches or threats, and it did not need to. It won by showing restraint when cruelty would have been easier, by offering dignity where humiliation was expected, by feeding enemies instead of breaking them. I carried that lesson back with me into a broken Germany, into a life rebuilt slowly among ruins, and it stayed with me through work, family, and loss, a quiet standard against which I measured power and character. When I hear younger men speak proudly of victory, I understand them, but I also know what they often miss, that the true test of strength is not how hard you strike, but how you behave when you do not have to strike at all. I have met Americans in the decades since the war, ordinary men who never knew my name or my story, and I have wanted to tell them that their country once spoke to me without words, at a moment when I was prepared to be destroyed. It did not absolve my past, and it did not erase what my people endured, but it forced me to confront a truth I could no longer hide from, that dignity can disarm where hatred only hardens. If I offer any thanks now, it is a quiet one, not for victory, but for the restraint that followed it, for the decision to see prisoners not as symbols, but as human beings. I did not leave America loving it, and I did not return hating Germany, but I came away knowing something I had not known before, something that has guided me longer than fear ever did. Hatred is easy. Dignity is not.